Last August, for about a week, my family and I went up to vacation in Portland, Maine. One evening, after spending a day in downtown Portland, I entered a gift shop called Mexicali Blues, and it sold an array of goods, from tie-dyed clothing to mandala or tree of life tapestry, incense, inexpensive mala beads, and not surprisingly, inexpensive Tibetan prayer flags. And they had various sizes of the flags, and I quickly glanced over them, and without much thought, I grabbed the smallest ones and thought, well, these look nice. Not until a few weeks later, when I hung them up in my room, did I realize how clearly the purchase was an impulsive buy. Although, even when I did realize that, I didn't think it was a big deal. I thought the $6 for the 5 sets of 10 flags seemed like a good deal. More than anything else, the aesthetics of the flags were what drew me in. The bright colors, the symmetrical squares of fabric hung neatly next to one another, and they're very calming to look at when they flutter under my ceiling fan. I knew, or at least I thought I knew, the meaning and uses of the flags. They were to promote peace and prayers. So I began to wonder, are many, or even most, flags seen around New York City, or everywhere else maybe, purchased with similar sentiments as mine? Prayer flags, then and now. With that, I was curious to look into the business side of things regarding the sales of objects that are marketable because of either their aesthetics or religious connotations they may carry. For example, mala beads seem to be worn just as much of a fashion statement than a religious one. In fact, if one is wearing them for public view, they are most likely wearing the beads because of their aesthetics than its originally intended purposes of assisting with prayer and meditation. However, to a shopkeeper trying to hustle his or her way through paying the exorbitant rent for the cramped store on St. Mark's Street, the reasons for a customer purchasing whatever item may not really matter. If customers are willing to purchase such goods and shopkeepers are happy to sell them, should we even bother to investigate beyond that to determine whether this manner of business is helping or hurting the karmic accruement for those involved? So I set out in an attempt to shed some light on the implications of monetizing prayer flags, much like how I was a part of this process when I bought them. However, as I began to ask around, going to shopkeepers, those working in nonprofit, and family friends, I soon began to see that the questions of whether or not it was proper to purchase prayer flags the way they are sold today produced pretty uninteresting answers. So one of them was something along the lines of, a basic tenet of Buddhism is to accept change. So for us to resist the commercial sales of such products would be, for those overtly resisting, quite un-Buddhist. Wait, so the preservation of tradition can be thrown out the window in order to preserve anicca, or impermanence? Such follow-up questions as these, although interesting, veered quickly away from crunching numbers of the sales of prayer flags, and that's what I was interested in. So I decided to drop the idea of pursuing commercial business attached to the sales of prayer flags and just decided to see, in general, what I could learn about them, both from online and book sources, as well as people I could speak to. So who better to ask than those that have personal accounts or stories concerning prayer flags? I never gave it a tremendous amount of thought, but as I began to seek them out, there is an overwhelming number of retail stores in New York City that advertise themselves as both being Tibetan and selling Tibetan goods. So that was it. That was my project right there. I would go around and just ask about prayer flags. My name is Aron Silverstein, and I'm going to talk about prayer flags. Okay, so some general background knowledge. Catherine Ann Paul writes, "In the Himalayas, colorful prayer flags wave in the wind, dispersing and expanding the powers of the prayers invested in and printed on the flags, thus increasing their efficacy." They predate the Buddhist tradition. Prayer flags are believed to have come from the Bon religion. Bonpo, those that practice Bon, used flags of primary colors in healing and medicinal rituals. Given the mountainous topography of the Himalayan regions, it makes sense that the Bon people would utilize flags in order to spread the mantras. Because rather than needing to trek the terrain and make prayers once at the peak of the mountains, the wind could just carry the prayers much more efficiently. As for the name itself, I've come across many spellings and hearing various pronunciations of what to call the prayer flags, but they're generally known as darcho, roughly translating to things that are offered to increase life, fortune, health, and happiness for all sentient beings. The two most common types of flags are the lungta, directly translating to wind horse, which are smaller square or rectangular flags that are hung horizontally on a length of string or twine. And I think this is what usually comes to mind when you think prayer flags. And the other kind is darchok, a much larger rectangular vertical flag that is hoisted up onto a pole. The lungta are quite often seen in a pattern of colors, and the colors represent many things, but often are attributed to the natural or astrological elements. The flags are hung in order, first with blue, which represents sky or water, then white, which is clouds, stars, snow, or iron, red, which is fire, green, which is wood, trees, forests, plants, or even water sometimes, and yellow, which is earth or soil. And this pattern of colors repeat if there are more than 5 flags hanging from the twine. An example today of the flags and colors representing a particular significance is the green flag being hoisted to honor and represent the 14th Dalai Lama. In accordance with the Chinese zodiac, which follows the lunar calendar, each person is assigned an element, an animal according to their birth date. The Dalai Lama is a wood boar, so for rituals that honor him in particular, green darchuks will be hoisted. Prayer flags can have solely text or just images, or both text and images, through the use of woodblock printing or even handwritten methods. A common depiction on the flags is the wind horse, consequently having the name lungta describing such flags. The horse symbolizes fame and good fortune, quite often used on victory banners when struggles, both public and personal, are overcome. Another example of a depiction is the 3 bodhisattvas, either with the respective mantras to invoke their images or simply depicting them without the mantras. With the 3 bodhisattvas, the flag are also known to depict and invoke the Trikaya, the 3 bodies that explain the nature and reality of Buddhism. So again, quoting Catherine Ann Paul, she says, "Generally speaking, the rituals associated with prayer flags, as well as the prayers and imagery printed on them, are intended to increase good things and prevent or suppress bad things." Okay, that's simple enough, but I wanted to ask around and see if that reflected what personal accounts are. I entered Mandala Tibetan store on St. Mark's. Before even approaching the cashier to ask about prayer flags, I saw a set hanging across the ceiling. They were flags in the usual set of 5 colors, each flag having 1 or 2 syllables of the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum. Each flag had a Tibetan letter with the English phonetics written out below the Tibetan letter, and it says Om Mani Padme Hum. Those are your 5 flags. Essence of Tibet, an online retailer of Tibetan goods, includes in their description of their flags, Tibetans and almost all Buddhists believe that it is very good to practice the mantra of Chenrezig. Chenrezig is the Tibetan name for Avalokitesvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. I asked the shopkeeper if he could share any personal accounts regarding prayer flags, and he said, "No, I don't really have any." So I asked whether or not prayer flags sold well in the shop, and when bought, what the customers said their intended use were. He said that those coming in to look for the flags usually knew what they were, and the reason for buying them was purification. I would later learn that there is, in general regarding the flags, a blessing ceremony called La Sang, although I've also been told this purification practice is called Rabni, that is done by a monk or lama, which entails ringing bells, reciting mantras, burning juniper bushes, and having a feast and making offerings to the gods, which then allows for the flags to be pure before being hung. So would those coming into the store at St. Mark's perform these purification rituals even before hanging the flags, or would that not be the proper use? Or do we even need to worry about that? While I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I came across Tibet's Jinten, a small, cramped store with low ceilings packed with gifts from the Himalayas. While speaking to Dorje, the store owner, he reminded me that their small, handy Tibetan calendars let you know which dates are auspicious or ominous concerning performing rituals, which included hanging flags. Some of the dates had the word bad day, while others had good day written on them. Easy enough. The Tibetan calendar is aligned with the lunar calendar, and therefore new moons and full moons usually represent auspicious points of the month. Entering a store called Dokam Tibet Emporium in Soho, now we're back in New York City, more common uses for the flags were revealed to me. A common practice is to personalize one's flags prior to hanging them. When visiting a Tibetan or Nepalese monastery, those who pray at these temples will write the names of loved ones on the flags in order to honor, preserve, or remember those that are closest to them. Their names will flutter in the wind alongside all of the other mantras floating through the air. So remembering this, I asked Dorje, back in Cambridge, Massachusetts, whether this was a common practice to personalize and write people's names on the prayer flags. He said yes, however, there might be other implications as to why locals have begun to tell visitors to do so. The most ideal location for prayer flags is to be hung at the highest possible altitude, which will in turn give the flags exposure to the purest air and the least likelihood of being stepped on if they fall off the hung post. So therefore, if hoisting them anywhere, it is better to hang them on a treetop to give the additional height of the tree itself. It's kind of funny. So tourists don't want to climb the trees, so to do the job, young Nepalese children are paid to climb the trees and hang the flags for others. Once the visitors have left, the children may climb up the tree and take the flags down in order to resell them. So if the flags do not have names or any personalization done onto them, it becomes much easier to resell, and therefore it would increase the likelihood of the visitors' flags being taken down, thus rendering them ineffective. So I began to see both sides of a single story. People do in fact personalize flags and write the names of loved ones before hanging them. However, there are other reasons as to why people have started to do so. The issue with this anecdote is that I don't get the sense of what the implications for the players in this scenario are, meaning maybe these children do truly feel anxiety about accruing negative karma when reselling the flags, but just purely out of necessity, they do so in order to raise money. Or maybe they don't. And these people that are going as a tourist to a temple or a hillside or a treetop and hanging these flags may not really know the reasons or rituals behind these flags, and therefore, just by hanging them, maybe they're not accruing positive karma. And in general, maybe they're not too concerned about that. So that was the transition into my next big question. Ritualistic, non-ritualistic, traditional, customized, personalized, are there proper and improper uses of these flags when used with proper intentions? So with that notion of personal use, I dug further into the customization of prayer flags. When visiting Etsy.com, an online retailer of handmade goods, and searching prayer flags, results came up, but were not limited to, something along the lines of chakra prayer flags, Tibetan-style batik prayer flags, yoga meditational prayer flags, rainbow fairy love prayer flags, hippie prayer flag for peace, birthing prayer flags, and yes, even 12-inch panty prayer flags of reclaimed materials. So clearly there is diverse personalization. And I wanted to get in on the fun, make something myself. So as I discussed this project with my professor, we explored different ideas of this aspect of customizing the flags for personal needs. Now, as a side note, a big one, but a side note nonetheless, is that when speaking about personalization, we should now recognize that this is bypassing the larger purpose of prayer flags as being used to honor transcendent beings. So, if we are to begin discussing what is and isn't proper use, we have to put a pin in this to get off the ground. So, moving on, my initial idea was centralized around the money attached to prayer flags. So, my professor and I thought, money, flags, money, flags? And with this idea came to mind a link to something that was previously mentioned. If we are to use prayer flags in their original state with the 5 colors and mantras and images, not fully knowing the origins might be excusable. However, when personalizing a flag and not being fully invested in it, that doesn't make that much sense to me. If anyone writes the names of loved ones, let's indeed honor them, but let's not also romanticize the act simply because there is an image of peace and religion behind it. Similarly, if prayer flags are hung to bring good fortune to a pregnant mother, hopes of doing well on an exam or sports match, or bless a newly opened business, which are uses of the flags, let's be direct about it. Let's be direct about why they're hung. So with that, I thought, if we are hoping for general good fortune, but really have money on our minds, is it wrong to call it what it is? Make flags that represent what's on our mind? Or is this just indecent? If you had made your own personal flags 10 and 20 years ago, what would they have looked like? And if you made flags at this very moment, what would those look like? And in 10 and 20 years, if you make your own flags, what will they look like? A big thank you to the New School, the India-China Institute, and the Rubin Museum of Art for making this project possible. Also, a big thank you to those that were willing to generously share their personal accounts with me, which allowed me to put all of the content you heard together. A final thought I want to end on was something that Annie, the shop owner of Docom in Soho, mentioned earlier, said about prayer flags. She believed that there were 2 main reasons why they were still around. One was that they have a transportive property, that people hang them up even if it's indoors and see themselves at the peak of a Himalayan mountain. It serves as an oasis for those that seek the real thing. And 2, the most simple and profound thing was that they're around and are effective because, well, people believe.